David Foster Wallace knew all the way back in the 1990s that modern poetry sucked. And over the past 20 years since Wallace's death, it has only gotten worse. And today we are going to hear Wallace speak at length about what happened to modern poetry. Because as you see by the length of this video, this is a very complicated topic. And my name is Ian, and here on Write Conscious, we talk about David Foster Wallace. In the playlist down below, you will find over 100 videos on Wallace's books, his life, and his philosophy. And so, enough yapping for me. Let us now hear from Wallace. I think avant-garde fiction has already gone the way of poetry, and it's become involuted and forgotten the reader. Put it this way. There are a few really good poets who suffered because of the desiccation and involution of poetry. But for the most part, I think American poetry has gotten what it's deserved. And I'll come awake again when poets start speaking to people who have to pay the rent and fuck the same woman for 30 years. That's off the record. That's really nasty. And I think that there is a slight error in Wallace's thinking here because there has been a long-standing tradition in poetry and in poetic movements to say that we are writing for the average everyday reader now. This really started with William Wordsworth, and Wordsworth would go on and on about having to write poetry for the people again. And then you read Wordsworth poetry and you're like, wait, you say you're writing for this poetry, for guys at the bar? And this kind of narrative that we need to be writing poetry for the people really convolutes poetry, which already has so many apparitions of its definition out there in the world. Because is poetry slam poetry or poetry that rhymes or the modern political poetry that is out there? Is it the oral tradition? Is it rap? Is it this? Is it Robert Frost, the modernists, the language poets? And so there is no grounding in the phenomenology of ontology in this moment, the beingness of being with what poetry is and where we are going with it. And all of this confusion is further reinforced by a lot of the mantras that we've been programmed with in the poetic tradition, like anything is poetry, just write, just express yourself. It's all poetry. It's all good. And even though that's true, if we are going to make a movement, if we are even going to accomplish the goal of getting the average everyday reader or individual at the grocery store to start taking poetry seriously and contemplating it, we are going to have to start holding ourselves to higher standards, knowing where we are at in space and time, understanding the origins of poetry, and understanding, where we went wrong in terms of poetry. Robert Bly called it the wrong turn in poetry and has talked about it extensively. And so when we look at the oral tradition of poetry, which is over 5,000 years old, obviously it was performative and the average member of the tribe could comprehend it. But in 2024, we have no monomyth. We have no shared culture and tribe most of the time. And so we can't necessarily get away with a lot of that because I have witnessed many different movements that have started on a local level where poets tried to bring it back to the people. And I'm going to keep this short, but I grew up in Las Vegas and did part of my university there, ran writing groups there. And back in 2014 or so, there was this group that cropped up in Las Vegas and they would perform poetry at bars. And it was mostly men with, tattoo kind of hipster types. We could call them lit bros. And they would get up there and do like Rupi Kaur-esque poetry that was somewhat elevated. But it was all very confessional poetry about dark things. But what it ended up becoming, and I think what it was from the start, was a way for all the kind of top guys in the group to screw all the chicks that joined the movement. And I've talked about this on the channel before, and I've had so many people reach out to me from the Northwest, from New Hampshire, from all these different places and say, hey, the same thing happened over here. And it's sad because when you look at what we can connect with as a collective in 2024, it is Rupi Kaur, Gabby Hanna as stuff. I am a teacher. The journey of us getting the average everyday individual to care about someone like Rilke, like Antonio Machado, Lorca, or another beautiful Spanish symbolist is much further than any of us, I think, most of you guys could imagine. But where did this start? Well, at some point after kind of the Grail myths, because when you look at Beowulf and the Grail myths, they are somewhat connected to nature. They are written in the spirit and form of the collective, of the group, and of nature, and have a purpose. And the Grail myths were used as a form of individuation. However, starting with Dante and others, and then being picked up by Boccaccio and his Decameron and in Chaucer, we started moving away from stories grounded in myth and in nature, and moving towards stories grounded, or elevated into the celestial realm of God. And there started to be a tradition of one-upmanship. Who can write better than Dante? Because Boccaccio inspired Chaucer, and Chaucer took the Decameron to the next level in the Canterbury Tales. And then Shakespeare took Chaucer to the next level. And we've been on that train ever since. And obviously, this ripped us away from the energies of poetry and connection. And this is still happening today. And this is sad. To speak to my modern writers out there really fast before I hop back into my historical analysis. Many of us are disconnected from our elders in poetry because we've all written poetry before. And when it's combined with the idea that anything is poetry, we can just sit down and write a poem. I can sit down and write a poem right now and call it poetry, and it could be pretty well. I could use my logic or, feel something and write it down, and boom, there's a poem. But when you think about the origins of poetry and even the concept of poetry, trying to create a message, an image, a feeling in the shortest amount of words possible, it's not an easy task. And in time immemorial, you would learn how to do that from your elders. You would learn and first copy their stories. There were tribal traditional stories that you would put your own spin on, and then maybe you would add to that canon if you were one of the best. But first and foremost, everybody knew how to tell the stories. But many of us are interlopers. We are actually not connected to any poetic tradition out there. We have no respect for our elders. And the elders that we may know may be really far and kind of disconnected from us, like Walt Whitman or others. And it makes it even harder because for the last 60 or 70 years in poetry, we actually have no real elders to look up to. There's obviously some people. But in my writing programs, I studied under a poet named Donald Ravel. And I learned a ton and I got way better at poetry. But I feel like everything I was learning was to impress him and impress other writers. And that's what the modern MFA factory machine has become, is everyone just trying to one-up each other and do little quirks within this little poetic space. And all of this innovation doesn't lead anywhere, because if you look at, for instance, the tech industry, a bunch of people experimenting and making new apps eventually leads to innovation, because there is a eventual pathway that if someone creates something over here, that Google or someone could take it and then transmute it into something bigger. But in poetry, that's really not the case. And we're in a rough situation in the modern era, because we are feeling as a collective more emotions than ever. We have more time and leisure and ability through whatever means to feel kind of a wide range of emotions. And that has led to more people being depressed and suicidal and all these things than ever. And also more people being extremely happy and content and living a long and happy life, and their family all living long and happy lives. And so we have this wide range of emotion that we want to express. But at some point in American poetry, which I would say the 1970s, early 1980s, we stopped growing. And then when you go back to, like I said, around Dante's time, we've stopped growing as a collective, as poets. And if you don't understand what I mean by this, well, we have to go back to Genesis and the divorce of nature from religion, the hierarchy putting humans and God above nature. And it wasn't until Romanticism and German idealism came into the world that we finally escaped the sleep that we had been put in, because Hölderlin, who we're about to read a poem from in a second, was roommates with Hegel and Schelling, two of the greatest philosophers of all time, who also innovated philosophy and broke us away from the Christian slumber, for better or for worse. But Hölderlin wrote this poem, Bread and Wine, which is obviously jabbing at Christianity, back at the start of the 19th century. And Hölderlin writes, quote, "Oh friend, we arrived too late. The divine energies are still alive, but isolated above us in the archetypal world. They keep on going there, and apparently don't bother if humans live or not. That is a heavenly mercy. Sometimes a human's clay is not strong enough to take the water." So look at this line again. The divine energies are still alive, but isolated above us in the archetypal world. And so poetry has gone wrong, and we are so disconnected from poetry because when you look at the modern everyday poem, what primordial sense is it connected to? What tradition or myth or deeper level of knowledge is it connected to? Because when you look at the greatest works of all time, when you look at the Duino elegies by Rilke, or the sonnets to Orpheus, or some of Walt Whitman's stuff, or the Chinese poets, or what James Wright was doing in the 1960s by kind of reinvigorating the Chinese poets, and what so many other great poets have done is that they've stepped into that. They've become that. They have become the primordial, like Robinson Jeffers. And this doesn't happen overnight. You just don't sit down at your desk and be like, oh, I'm just going to write about the prime, I'm going to write about something like that today. And that's the problem that we have, is that right now, anyone could sit down and write a decent book, a decent novel, and anyone can really sit down and write a decent poem. But a novel is based on logic. You have to logically put it all together and make sure it all makes sense. And there are times when you can leap and create really creative lines, but in general, you need to keep it very grounded for the reader. But in poetry, we have this short burst of expression. And you can't fake it. You can't logic your way to feeling, or showing people the connection to the divine or whatever it is. You can't do it if you weren't centering your life around it. Rilke wandered for 10 years and didn't write any poetry, waiting for the moment, and in 2 weeks composed the Duino elegies and sonnets to Orpheus. And so the task of being a poet, to be a poet, requires you to center your life around it, in my opinion. It requires you to do things that may actually remove your ability to be able to write actual good prose or be able to interact in society, because a poet transcends logic. They transcend politics and boundaries and start to interact on the ground, below and above, with all the various energies, like how Whitman was doing, but with technology, with all these convoluted definitions of poetry and everything going on there. It is becoming more impossible every single year for us to be able to do that. And so when Wallace says that we need to remember the reader, that doesn't mean you need to dumb down your poem. That means that your work needs to have meaning. That means that when you look at the bookshelf behind you, or when you look at the greatest poets of all time and you look at the transformation and the energy that they're putting on the table, that means that you need to try to do that too. And obviously, you're not going to do that for a decade or two. And, some people say you shouldn't publish poetry for that long, because you're just saturating the space. There are people all the time in my YouTube comments who are like, hey, check out my poem. And it's garbage. I mean, I'll just say it. And this type of poetry cannot get you into MFA programs. It cannot sustain a job. It cannot get you a grant. You can't sit and give a speech about it. You can't sit and say this is about racial justice or representing this tradition. It's not meant to be sold. It's meant to transform. And a lot of people aren't necessarily willing to go on that journey. And understandably so, because in my opinion, most writers are on this journey because they haven't really thought out what the hell they are doing. They just kind of fell into this because they feel talented as a writer and they like reading books. And so they said, hey, why not? Why not try to kind of tie myself to this dream so that I have hope at work every single day? And that's cool. And don't worry, I do that all the time too. The modern drudgery is insane. But I call for fiction writers, for, to fully dedicate themselves to that craft, to fully dedicate themselves to living that out and centering their whole life around it. And the same with poets. And it looks different in every single field. And so this is all to say that I think that Wallace is wrong here, that we first need to start within. And this is where I came up with this idea of the literary renaissance. We need to activate ourselves first. We need to come together as a movement and become mavens, and then other people will start to be attracted to us. The sphere of influence. This is what happened with the mythopoetic movement in the 1990s, which is actually the origin of men's movements. When you see Andrew Tate out here, he is just a projection of the most malignant aspect of what the mythopoetic movement was trying to do back in the 1990s. And that movement never got off the ground because it was hijacked by the internet and Columbine and that whole mentality that started viewing women and the feminine as the enemy and yada, yada, yada. And here we are today. But the movement doesn't start for writing for other people. It starts for writing for God or writing for nature or writing for your deepest self, no matter what you believe. Writing on that level and living it and believing it and then doing it over a period of time. And so when I imagine this whole concept of the literary renaissance, a spiritual and educational awakening through literature, there are different fields. There are going to be the people out there who are speaking and doing kind of the promotional aspects like I am doing. Then there are going to be all the fiction writers out there kind of filling all the little sub niches and pushing the boundaries in their own way. Then there are going to be all the bloggers and the nonfiction people who are going to be kind of reaching a much broader audience. But at the top of all of that, at the top of the pyramid are the poets. They are the ones who are going to come out when we all come together and give a performance. You know, no one wants to go and see someone read a nonfiction essay. No one wants to go and see someone read a chapter from their book or a short story. I've been to a million of those types of readings. They suck, even if the story's good. Maybe I just have ADHD. But when we finally start getting boots on the ground, when we finally start showing people, because guys, it's crazy. If you were trying to get someone into literature, trying to awaken them, it's a bad idea to send them an essay or a trippy short story that you really like, or give them Infinite Jest. But over in my free writing school, if you guys want to join, I run a free writing school. There have been collaborations happening where, you know, people are combining music and art and poetry and all their different skills and coming together as one. And that's something I would show somebody. I actually sent that to one of my friends who's not that into literature. He was like, damn, that's crazy, bro. That was really good. So that's what we are looking for from the poets, is what Wallace is talking about. But when you look at poets, so as a poet, you should have a couple things that you can perform. You should have those bite-sized pieces to get everyone in. But then you send them into the storm. And I don't know, as a society, if we are ready for poetry again. Because when I look at poets like Amiri Baraka, who was like a communist and hated white people and stuff like that, like, he didn't care. He like, after, I mean, there was a famous, I think, clip of him on Bill O'Reilly or something where he was like, yeah, thank God 9/11 happened or something like that. It's like, oh my God, that guy's crazy. But then if you look at his history as Leroy Jones and as Amiri Baraka and some of his beautiful poetry, it's shocking. It's jarring. I read it sometimes. I'm like, dude, this guy's crazy. But then other times I connect with it and I'm like, damn, I really understand what you guys are trying to do over here in this political movement or with urban renewal projects or whatever. Like, wow, it really kind of opened me up a little bit, even if logically I don't agree. And so that's what happens when someone gets into poetry. And the same with all writing. But that's the problem with slam poetry. That's the problem with many of these poets, is that, yeah, you can sit and do some elevated Rupi Kaur stuff. We all could right now, and people would like it. But then you can only do that for so long. You can only talk about your emotions and these things for so long. And then the question is, so what? And then now what? And so that's what we need to work on as a collective group of poets is, yes, having performative things, having things that hit. But those will come out of us working on our general body of collection, which comes out of us appreciating silence and not pushing ourselves to write poetry instantly. Because I have witnessed hundreds of people just say, I'm going to write a poem, and, you know, and they're practicing, and that's okay. I'm a teacher. I do it every single year. But in terms of commercialization and the speed of society, it just is really hard for people to comprehend. You know, there are famous stories of people going up to, you know, some of the greatest poets of all time and being like, hey, how can I write like you? And they're like, hey, just go sit in a room for 2 years ago. You know, just go live in the woods for 2 years and don't talk to anyone, and then you'll be ready. And even though that sounds extreme, it's actually true. The more solitude and inward I go, the better I become as a poet. And it's actually very hard because I have to do all this extroverted video stuff. And so to wrap up, modern poetry sucks, not just because we aren't writing for people. It's because we are still disconnected from the rich tradition of where poetry started. We are still disconnected from our purpose as poets. We are still disconnected from the idea that we can't use logic to write good poetry. Use logic in every other aspect of your life. So boom, there you guys have it. You guys already know this is Write Conscious. You are only going to find videos like this here. Poetry, as you maybe can tell, is one of my favorite things to talk about. I never really get to talk about it because no one actually cares about poetry anymore.